Hello, my name is Brittany Hart, and the passage that I chose to analyze is Our Own Stories Running into an Old Friend by Beth T. Lewis. As I read the title of this article, I began making the connection and thinking about old friends of my own. What would I do if I ran into an old friend? Would I catch up? Um, who are they going to be describing as an old friend in this passage? This passage was written by Beth T. Lewis, and just at this point, I'm just adjusting my reading pace to show focus on the attention of the author's importance. After reading lines 1 through 6 in the first paragraph, as I read, reading an absorbing story is similar to actually experiencing the event. I begin to analyze and make connections to the text. I think back to the stories and books that have stuck with me over the years and realize that those readings have been ingrained with me as a memory. As I finished reading the first paragraph, I begin to make inferences as far as the author's purpose for writing this passage. I think to myself, this author is focused on the importance of the connection with a good book. I start to think critically and reach beyond the text as I make my own connections with a good book. Some of my childhood favorite books, like Nancy Drew and the memories of reading with my parents. In line 7, as I read the snippet about the author's childhood memorable story about Caddy Woodlawn, I begin to synthesize new information. I personally have never read this story, and I wasn't sure what it was about until the author gives me a little bit of a preview. I begin to make a connection to another series that I read at a young age called Little House on the Prairie. From how the author describes Caddy Woodlawn, I start to compare her to Laura Ingalls Wilder. I make this connection when the author describes Caddy as running the woods of Wisconsin. In lines 8 through 10, the author describes a black and white illustration from the story of Caddy Woodlawn and how it made her feel as though she was truly part of the scene. At this point in the passage, I began making my own inferences. I do not know the story that the author is describing, but it seems as though it takes place in the past. The author describes the characters getting ready to cross the Menominee River with their spare clothes on the top of their head, and her being able to relate to that scene. She says that she can picture herself standing along Caddy Woodlawn participating. As I read the section with lines 11 through 16, the author is describing the way this story made her feel and how she was able to relate to it. I start to make connections of my own. I think about all of the stories I've read and the specific ones that have stood out to me. Again, I connect to Little House on the Prairie series. I also connect with the Harry Potter series and the Nancy Drew series, and as I reflect on this, I realize that I am connecting with series of books, and I start to think that this could be because a series requires focus and attention and concentration, and to spend that much time on a book, it begins to become a memory with you. In this next section, it consists of lines 17 through 23. The author describes how she was introduced to Caddy Woodlawn stories. I begin to synthesize new information. I find out that it was a teacher who introduced her to this, and I begin to reflect on myself as a teacher and how well I know my students to be able to help them find a book that speaks to them or they can relate to. I think about the effect that it had on the author, Beth, and how much it's impacted her life for her to be able to see this book in a Goodwill store and have these memories. This next paragraph consists of lines 23 through 32, and the author goes on to explain in detail how her teacher, Mrs. Zoom, helped foster her love for reading the Caddy Woodlawn stories. She describes her teacher as dressing like a pioneer woman. She shares omni reading, which I find out that it meant students were allowed time to read their favorite book in class. She includes that her teacher provided cozy book spaces for the students to read in. And at this point, I begin to synthesize all of this new information being provided in the text, along with analyzing that new information. So I think about how her teacher did not just provide her with a book that she thought Beth would like. She included times throughout the day for Beth to be able to read her book. She provided comfortable spaces for her to really be able to dig deep into her story. I think that it's important to remember as teachers that we don't just provide an idea. I can't just say, oh, I think this story, you'll like it, but to also give students the opportunity to dig deep into that story. In this last section, consisting of lines 33 through 38, it really summarizes that the Caddy Woodlawn story may not have the same impact on children today as it did for Beth due to the different interests. However, she reinforces this with the importance of her connection to the story and how it left her feeling as though she truly experienced those adventures along with Caddy Woodlawn and her brothers. So here at this point, I begin to recall information from the beginning of the passage, and I reflect on the impact that Caddy Woodlawn series had on the author Beth. She made this connection as she ran into her, as she called it, her old friend in a Goodwill store. And I just think about how she compares this story and all of these adventures that she was able to go on as a good friend. I reflect on myself as an educator, and I wonder, am I fostering the love for reading of books like Mrs. Zoom? Am I going to have students one day run into maybe a story that they fell in love with in a Goodwill store? And then I ask myself, how can I reach a student and help them find a book that they can fall in love with? In line 39 of this passage, it provides us of a little background on the author, Beth T. Lewis. And I synthesize this new information when I read this final line describing that she teaches at the University of Southern California, teaching English as a second language. I analyze and I reflect on her thoughts on the importance of reading. I can imagine that she holds reading to a high standard. She knows the importance of diving into books and reading many different types of books, as that enhances the English language. In line 40 of this passage, I notice that the author provides a reference for the Caddy Woodlawn story that she fell in love with as a young child and then grew into having all of these memories and adventures with that story. After reading this passage and actually doing this think aloud, I have become more interested in wanting to find more about the Caddy Woodlawn story. I had never heard of it before, and for the impact that it's had on Beth T. Lewis, I'm pretty interested in what it's about and the impact.